The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Massachusetts Historical Society's archive room on Boylston Street, casting long golden shadows across the mahogany tables where Dr. Sarah Mitchell worked in concentrated silence. Outside, the sounds of modern Boston traffic hummed distantly, but inside this climate-controlled sanctuary of history, time moved differently. At 34 years old, with a doctorate from Harvard and nearly a decade of specialized research behind her, Sarah had examined thousands of Civil War-era photographs. She could identify daguerreotype techniques at a glance, date images within a year based on clothing and photographic methods, and extract stories from fading emulsions that others might overlook entirely. But nothing in her extensive training or experience had prepared her for what she was about to discover on this particular Tuesday afternoon in March. Sarah adjusted her white cotton conservation gloves, a habit so ingrained she barely noticed the motion anymore, and carefully removed the daguerreotype from its protective archival sleeve. The protective casing was original, brass with ornate engravings, showing the patina of age but remarkably well preserved. Someone had cared for this image across generations. The portrait showed the Whitmore family of Boston, the date stamped carefully on the back, April 18, 1861. Just days before the first shots of the American Civil War would echo across Charleston Harbor at Fort Sumter, changing the nation forever. The timing alone made the photograph historically significant. Charles Whitmore stood rigid and formal in his dark wool suit, his posture reflecting the strict photographic conventions of the era. His face showed the weathering of a man in his late 40s, a successful merchant whose textile business had made him one of Boston's more prominent citizens. Beside him sat Catherine Whitmore, her elaborate silk dress spreading across the chair in carefully arranged folds, the fabric probably imported from France or England, a display of wealth and taste. Her expression was serene but not warm, the controlled composure expected of women of her social standing. Their 3 children were arranged around them with practiced stillness. William, the eldest at 12, already showing the serious demeanor his father would expect of a future business heir. Margaret, 10 years old, in her finest dress with ribbons carefully placed, and little Elizabeth, just 5, whose slight blur suggested she had moved during the long exposure time required for the photograph. But it was the figure standing slightly apart, positioned near the edge of the frame almost as an afterthought, that caught and held Sarah's attention. A young man, perhaps 25 years old, dressed in simple but clean clothing that marked him clearly as household staff rather than family. His jacket was well made but plain, his collar white and starched, his posture different from the family members. Where the Whitmores held themselves with aristocratic stiffness, this young man stood more naturally, almost relaxed despite the photographic constraints. His face was handsome in an understated way, with intelligent eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera and across the decades. The historical record, written in faded ink on the back of the photograph's case, identified him simply as Thomas, household staff. No last name. No further details. Just another anonymous domestic worker captured at the margins of a wealthy family's portrait. Sarah had seen hundreds, perhaps thousands, of similar portraits during her career. Wealthy 19th-century families often included their domestic workers in formal photographs, a practice that modern historians found both fascinating and deeply troubling depending on the circumstances and context. Sometimes it reflected genuine affection and respect. Other times it was a display of property and status, human beings reduced to possessions to be catalogued alongside fine furniture and silverware. Without additional context, it was often impossible to know which interpretation was correct. But something about this particular image nagged at Sarah's trained instincts. Something felt different, though she couldn't immediately articulate what. She reached for her high-powered magnifying glass, a professional-grade optical tool that allowed her to examine daguerreotypes at extreme magnification without risking damage to the delicate surface. Leaning closer, she began a systematic examination of the image, starting with the family members and moving methodically toward the edges. The Whitmores showed no unexpected details. Standard formal clothing, appropriate jewelry, conventional poses. But when she reached Thomas, when she carefully examined every visible detail of his figure, her breath caught. There, on his left wrist, barely visible where his sleeve had ridden up slightly, probably accidentally during the long minutes of holding still for the photograph, was a mark. Not a shadow created by the photographic process. Not an artifact of the daguerreotype's silver surface. An actual mark on the skin. Sarah's heart began to race as she adjusted the magnification, bringing the detail into sharper focus. It appeared to be a deliberate pattern, almost like a tattoo or brand, but the design was unusual for the period. Geometric. Intentional. Precise. It looked almost like numbers or letters, combined with some kind of symbol, but the resolution of the photograph made it difficult to be absolutely certain. Sarah immediately pulled out her laptop, opening her extensive personal database of period photographs that she had compiled over years of research. She cross-referenced the Whitmore name, finding several mentions in Boston business directories and newspaper archives from the 1850s and 1860s. The Whitmore family had been prominent textile merchants in Boston, known for their progressive political views and considerable wealth generated through careful business practices and strategic investments. Charles Whitmore had been an early vocal supporter of the Union cause when political tensions escalated, though at 48 years old in 1861 he was far too old for military service when the war finally erupted. The family had maintained detailed business records, shipping manifests, property documents, and financial ledgers, most of which had been preserved and were accessible to researchers. But surprisingly, frustratingly, there was almost nothing in the historical record about their domestic arrangements, their household staff, or the daily personal life of the family behind closed doors. This absence was not unusual. Wealthy families meticulously documented their business dealings but rarely thought their household staff worthy of historical preservation. Domestic workers lived and worked and died, and history forgot them almost immediately. But Sarah had built her career on recovering those forgotten voices, on finding the people who existed at the margins of the historical record. And now, looking at Thomas's face in that photograph, at that mysterious mark on his wrist, she felt the familiar excitement of a significant discovery beginning to unfold. The next morning arrived cold and crisp, typical Boston spring weather with temperatures still hovering near freezing despite the calendar insisting winter was over. Sarah drove her practical Honda Civic through the winding streets of Beacon Hill, past the elegant brick row houses and brownstones that seemed frozen in the 19th century, their gas-style street lamps and cobblestone sidewalks carefully preserved as historical treasures. She was meeting with Professor James Hartwell, a colleague from Boston University who specialized in immigrant labor history in pre-Civil War New England. If anyone in the academic community could help her understand the significance of that mark on Thomas's wrist, it would be James. His office at Boston University was exactly what one would expect from a distinguished history professor who had been teaching for nearly 40 years. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, their spines showing the wear of constant consultation. Old photographs in cheap frames covered every available surface. Reproductions of period documents were pinned haphazardly to a large corkboard. File boxes were stacked in corners. The desk itself was barely visible under layers of papers, notes, and half-finished research projects. James Hartwell, a distinguished man in his mid-60s with wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose and a perpetual expression of curious intensity, welcomed her warmly, immediately clearing a precarious stack of doctoral dissertations from a chair so she could sit. "Sarah," he said with genuine pleasure, "what brings you here on such short notice? Your email said you had found something unusual, which coming from you means it must be genuinely extraordinary. You're not one for overstatement." She pulled out high-resolution digital prints of the Whitmore portrait that she had prepared the previous evening, including several enlarged details that showed Thomas's face and, more importantly, his wrist. "This mark," she said, pointing with a pen to avoid touching the prints. "On the young man's wrist. Have you ever seen anything like it in your research on domestic workers and immigration patterns?" James took the prints and studied them for a long moment, his expression shifting from casual professional interest to something much more focused and intense. He stood suddenly, walking to one of his many filing cabinets with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested he had just made an important connection. He pulled out a worn folder filled with photocopied sketches and handwritten notes accumulated over decades of research. "I've seen something similar," he said slowly, carefully, laying out several documents beside Sarah's photographs. But not commonly. Not from Boston specifically, though the practice existed here. These marks were used by certain immigrant aid societies in the 1850s, primarily serving Irish immigrants who came over during and immediately after the Great Famine. Some charitable organizations and church groups would create identification systems for workers they placed in households, partly to keep accurate records for their own purposes, partly as a practical attempt to protect workers from exploitation and abuse. Sarah felt a surge of excitement mingling with scholarly caution. So Thomas might have been an Irish immigrant? That would make sense given the timeline. The Great Famine was 1845 to 1852, and this photograph is 1861. The timing fits perfectly. Possibly, probably even, James said, warming to the topic with the enthusiasm of someone discussing a favorite subject. But there's more complexity here than just identification. These weren't common marks that every immigrant received. They were used specifically by an organization called the Boston Society for the Protection of Irish Laborers. It was founded in 1853 by a coalition of progressive merchants, wealthy philanthropists, and Catholic clergy who were genuinely concerned about the exploitation they saw happening to desperate Irish immigrants. The famine had brought hundreds of thousands of desperate people to America, and unfortunately, many were taken advantage of by unscrupulous employers who saw vulnerable workers as exploitable resources. The society tried to create a different system, one based on documentation, accountability, and mutual respect. And they kept records? Sarah asked, already knowing the answer but needing the confirmation. Meticulous records, James confirmed with a knowing smile. That was their whole purpose, really. They documented every person they helped. Names, ages, specific places of origin in Ireland, documented skills, and crucially, the families or businesses where workers were placed. They created contracts, set minimum standards for treatment and wages, and conducted periodic inspections. It was remarkably progressive for the 1850s. If Thomas had this mark, if he was part of their system, there absolutely should be documentation. The question is whether those records survived, and if they did, where they might be now. The archives of the Boston Society for the Protection of Irish Laborers, James informed her, were housed in a rather unexpected location, the basement of St. Patrick's Church in the North End, Boston's historic Italian and Irish immigrant neighborhood. The society had formally dissolved in 1892, its mission accomplished or perhaps simply made obsolete by changing immigration patterns and social conditions. Its records had been transferred to the church that had provided its original meeting space, and there they had remained, largely untouched and almost completely unexamined by modern historians. For over a century, Sarah spent the next 3 days in that church basement, her fingers protected by archival gloves, her lungs occasionally irritated by dust despite her careful handling. The records were remarkably detailed, exactly as James had promised, but they were also extensive and not particularly well organized. Leather-bound ledgers were stacked on metal shelving, arranged roughly by year but without any more sophisticated cataloging system. Each ledger contained hundreds of entries, handwritten in various styles depending on which society volunteer had been on duty that particular day. She worked methodically, starting with 1857 and working forward, checking every name, reading every entry, searching for Thomas. On the third day, when Sarah's eyes were starting to blur from reading 19th century handwriting under inadequate basement lighting, she found him. Thomas Brennan, age 23 when he arrived in Boston in August 1857. Born in County Cork, Ireland, in a small village called Ballymore. Listed skills: reading, writing, basic accounting, carpentry, and notably, some Latin and mathematics. Placed with the Whitmore household as a general assistant on September 3, 1857, at a monthly wage of $8 plus room and board, which was actually above the average for domestic workers at that time. The entry noted that he had arrived alone, with no family in America, seeking a fresh start after the devastating famine had claimed his parents and his younger sister, whose names were listed as Daniel Brennan, Mary Brennan, and Catherine Brennan respectively. But there was something else, something that made Sarah's pulse quicken. A note in the margin, written in different handwriting than the main entry, added sometime later. It read, exceptional character and ability, recommended for advancement to more substantial position, special circumstances regarding placement and development. See Supplementary File 1857-047. Sarah's hands actually trembled slightly as she searched for the supplementary file system. When she finally located it, tucked away in a separate box in a corner of the basement that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades, she understood immediately why this story had been forgotten by historians. The supplementary files weren't just bureaucratic records. They were letters, personal correspondence, human voices speaking across the centuries. The file for Thomas Brennan contained letters from Charles Whitmore himself, written to the Society's director, a progressive Protestant minister named Reverend Jonathan Hughes. The letters spanned from 1858 to 1861, and they painted an extraordinary picture of Thomas's life and development within the Whitmore household. The earliest letter, dated March 1858, just 6 months after Thomas's arrival, was formal but contained notes of surprise. Charles Whitmore wrote about discovering that his new household assistant could not only read but possessed education beyond what Whitmore had initially assumed possible for an Irish immigrant from a rural background. The letter described how Thomas had quietly corrected an error in the household accounts, saving the family a considerable sum, and how this had prompted Whitmore to investigate his background more thoroughly. But it was a letter from March 1861, written just weeks before the photograph Sarah had discovered, that contained the revelation that changed everything she thought she understood about the relationship between these two men. Sarah's apartment overlooking Boston Harbor had been transformed over the past week into something resembling a detective's investigation room from a crime drama, except instead of tracking criminals, she was tracking history. Photocopies of letters were spread across every available surface, organized chronologically on her dining table, arranged by topic on her sofa, and pinned to a growing timeline she had created on her living room wall using colored string and index cards. Her cat, Dickens, named after her favorite Victorian novelist, navigated the paper landscape with practiced indifference, occasionally knocking something to the floor with his tail just to remind Sarah that regardless of historical significance, he still required regular feeding. The letter from March 1861, which Sarah had now read at least 20 times, sat in a place of honor on her desk, illuminated by her reading lamp like a sacred text. Charles Whitmore's words, written in the careful, practiced script of an educated businessman, had opened a door to a story Sarah never expected to find, a narrative that challenged simple categorizations of employer and employee, of American and immigrant, of the rigid social hierarchies that supposedly defined the 19th century. My dear Reverend Hughes, the letter began with formal courtesy. I write to you not in my customary capacity as a financial supporter of your society's charitable endeavors, but as a man whose life and family have been immeasurably enriched, indeed transformed, by your organization's noble work. Thomas Brennan, whom you placed in our household nearly 4 years ago now, has proven to be not merely an employee of exceptional competence, but a trusted advisor, a genuine friend, and indeed, a member of our family in all but the legal name we share. Sarah took a sip of her now cold coffee, grimacing at the temperature but too absorbed to bother reheating it, and continued reading, mouthing the words silently as she had done dozens of times already. I must confess, Reverend, to my shame, that when Thomas first arrived at our home, I harbored the common prejudices of my class and background. I expected competence in basic tasks, perhaps, but little more. The Irish, I had been taught by society and circumstance, were hardworking but limited, suited for manual labor but not intellectual pursuit. How wrong I was. How profoundly, embarrassingly wrong. What I found instead in Thomas Brennan was a young man of extraordinary ability and character, whose potential had been trapped by circumstances entirely beyond his control. The letter went on to describe, with remarkable detail and obvious genuine emotion, specific incidents that had gradually changed Charles Whitmore's understanding. Within 3 months of arriving, Thomas had reorganized the household accounts, creating a new system that identified inefficiencies Whitmore himself had overlooked for years despite his business acumen. Thomas's suggestions regarding their textile inventory management had saved the family considerable expense and improved their business operations significantly. But more than his practical contributions, which were considerable, it was Thomas's presence that had transformed the household atmosphere itself. Whitmore wrote about how Thomas had stayed up through 3 nights nursing young Elizabeth through scarlet fever when even the family doctor had privately expressed the opinion that the child would not survive. Thomas had read to her, kept cold compresses on her burning forehead, monitored her breathing, and simply refused to give up. When Elizabeth finally broke the fever and began to recover, the doctor had been astonished, and Catherine Whitmore had wept with relief and gratitude. The letter described how Thomas had discovered that the eldest son, William, was struggling miserably with mathematics, to the point where the boy was developing genuine anxiety about his schoolwork. The expensive tutors Whitmore had hired were making the situation worse with their stern, punitive approach. Thomas had quietly asked permission to try a different method, and within months, William was not only completing his mathematics assignments but actively enjoying them. Thomas had somehow taught the boy to see mathematics not as a burden of memorization but as a beautiful language of patterns and logic, a way of understanding the world. Catherine Whitmore, the letter revealed, had come to rely on Thomas's counsel during Charles's frequent business trips. Not just for household management, though Thomas handled those responsibilities with impressive competence, but for genuine advice on family matters, on the children's development, on decisions that required wisdom and judgment. She had told her husband that Thomas possessed what she called an old soul, a depth of understanding that seemed beyond his years, but it was the final paragraphs of the letter that revealed the true significance of the mark on Thomas's wrist, the mark that had started Sarah on this entire journey of discovery. You asked, Reverend, in your last correspondence, about the circumstances under which Thomas came to wear the Society's identification mark, and whether there had been any difficulties or concerns. I believe the time has come to address this matter openly and honestly, as I hope we have always strived for honesty between us. When Thomas arrived in America, he carried with him documents proving his education at a small Catholic seminary in Cork, before the famine made such pursuits impossible and indeed meaningless in the face of basic survival. He had studied there for 3 years, learning Latin, mathematics, literature, and history, preparing for a life in the church. That path was destroyed by events beyond anyone's control. He was, by all objective measures, overqualified for domestic service. His mind was trained for intellectual work, his education superior to many men of my own social class. Yet the prejudices of our society meant that his Irish heritage, his poverty, his lack of social connections, closed more doors than his abilities could possibly open. The mark, which some might view as a symbol of servitude or lesser status, Thomas wore with pride when he first came to us, and continues to wear with pride today. He told me once, in a conversation I shall never forget, that it represented something his devastated homeland could not give him: hope. It was proof, he said, that someone had believed in him, had invested in his future, had seen him as a human being worthy of respect and opportunity rather than as a problem to be managed or a resource to be exploited. For Thomas, that mark was not a brand of service or subservience, but a badge of possibility, a symbol that his life could be more than mere survival. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications. She needed to find more information about Thomas himself, to hear his own voice if possible. The historical record had preserved the Whitmore family's perspective, their observations and feelings, but what about Thomas's own thoughts, his own experiences? Did any of his personal writings survive, or was he destined to remain visible only through the lens of others' descriptions? The next morning, Sarah returned to St. Patrick's Church in the North End, but this time to speak with Father Michael O'Brien, the current pastor, whose family had been deeply connected to Boston's Irish Catholic community for 5 generations. If anyone knew about the personal records of Irish immigrants from the mid-19th century, records that might have been preserved through family networks or church channels rather than official archives, it would be Father O'Brien. Father O'Brien was a jovial man in his 70s with a shock of white hair that refused to stay combed and sharp blue eyes that missed very little. His study smelled pleasantly of old books and pipe tobacco, creating an atmosphere that was both comforting and scholarly. He welcomed Sarah with the easy warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed unexpected visitors bearing interesting historical questions. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, gesturing her to a comfortable chair, I heard you've been practically living in our basement archives. Sister Margaret mentioned she's been bringing you coffee and sandwiches. Found something interesting in all those dusty old ledgers. Sarah showed him the prints of the portrait and explained her research, describing her discoveries about Thomas Brennan and the letters from Charles Whitmore. Father O'Brien's expression grew increasingly thoughtful as he studied Thomas's face in the photograph. Brennan, he mused, rolling the name around as if tasting it. I know that name, and not just from church records, though we certainly have plenty of those. Every Irish family in Boston ends up in church records eventually. No, it's something else, something more personal. He stood with surprising agility for his age and walked to a glass-fronted bookcase that contained volumes that were clearly personal treasures rather than just reference materials. In the 1920s, he explained, running his finger along the spines until he found what he was looking for, my great-uncle, Father Patrick O'Brien, compiled an oral history project. He was ahead of his time in many ways, understood that stories die when people die unless someone makes the effort to preserve them. He interviewed elderly Irish immigrants about their experiences in Boston, about the challenges they faced, the lives they built, the America they found versus the America they had imagined. It was all handwritten, compiled into a few volumes, never formally published but preserved in our family. One of the interviews was with the daughter of a man who had worked for a wealthy family in Beacon Hill before the Civil War. He pulled out a leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed with age but the binding still solid. I haven't looked at this in probably 15 years, but I remember something about a household worker who had become something of a legend in the Irish community, someone who had achieved unusual success and respect. Let me see if I can find it. Together, they carefully turned the fragile pages, reading through interviews with long-dead voices describing a Boston that no longer existed. Finally, they found it, an interview with Margaret Sullivan, conducted in November 1923 when she was 82 years old. She spoke of her father, Thomas Brennan, with obvious pride, deep affection, and the kind of reverence reserved for family heroes. My father never spoke much of the old country. Margaret's words, transcribed nearly a century ago, seemed to echo across time with startling immediacy. The memories were too painful, the losses too great. He would sometimes mention his parents, my grandparents whom I never knew, always with a sort of quiet sadness that never fully left him. But despite that sadness, despite everything he had lost, he spoke often and warmly of the Whitmores, of the family he worked for, and of the society that had brought him to them in his darkest hour. He said, the interview continued, that the mark on his wrist had saved his life twice. Once when it got him honest work with honest people when he had nothing, when he was desperate and vulnerable and could easily have fallen into exploitation or worse. And once when it identified him after he was injured in a terrible train accident and lay unconscious, unable to speak his own name. Sarah's eyes widened. A train accident? Do you have more details? Father O'Brien turned the page carefully. Here, it continues. Listen to this. It was in the summer of 1862, during the war. My father was traveling with Mr. Whitmore on business to New York. The textile business was complicated by the war, supply chains disrupted, and Mr. Whitmore needed to meet with suppliers in person. He brought my father because he trusted him with the business details, relied on his judgment. There was a train accident outside of Providence, Rhode Island. Something wrong with the tracks, they said. The train derailed. Many people were killed instantly. Many more were injured. My father was badly hurt, his head struck, unconscious for days. The doctors weren't sure he would survive, and if he did survive, whether he would be himself again. Mr. Whitmore was thrown clear in the accident and survived with only minor injuries, cuts and bruises but nothing serious. But in the chaos immediately after the crash, in the confusion and horror, they were separated. My father was carried to a hospital in Providence, listed as an unidentified man, a John Doe. Without identification, without anyone to claim him, without money, he would have been just another body if he had died, buried in a pauper's grave with no one to remember him. But Mr. Whitmore refused to give up. He spent 3 days going to every hospital in Providence, looking for my father, describing him, asking everyone. When he finally found him, it was the mark on my father's wrist that confirmed his identity beyond all doubt. That mark, which some ignorant people might have seen as shameful, became the thread that connected my father back to life, back to family, back to purpose. Mr. Whitmore wept when he found him, my mother told me. Not as an employer relieved to locate a missing servant, but as a friend who had feared losing someone truly dear to him. Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes, her professional detachment crumbling in the face of this very human story. This was more than a historical curiosity, more than an interesting footnote about immigrant labor practices. This was a story of genuine human connection that had transcended the rigid social boundaries of the 19th century. "There's more," Father O'Brien said gently, clearly moved himself by the narrative. Margaret mentions that her father kept a journal throughout his life, wrote in it almost daily. She said he believed in the power of written records, of documenting life not just for himself but for future generations. She donated that journal to the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1925, shortly before she died. She wanted it preserved, wanted her father's voice to be available to history. "I suspect, Dr. Mitchell, that you'll find it particularly illuminating." The journal was smaller than Sarah had expected, perhaps 6 inches by 8 inches, bound in worn brown leather that had been handled thousands of times over decades of use. The pages were thin but remarkably well preserved, covered in neat, careful handwriting that showed the discipline of someone who had been trained in formal penmanship, probably at that seminary in Cork that Thomas had attended before the famine destroyed his plans. The archivist at the Massachusetts Historical Society handled it with appropriate reverence, placing it on the special cushioned book support they used for fragile volumes, as Sarah settled into her chair with a mixture of excitement and something approaching spiritual anticipation. "We have it properly catalogued," the archivist explained, "a young woman named Jennifer who specialized in 19th century manuscript materials. But I'll confess honestly, not many researchers have examined it over the years. It's listed simply as Personal Diary of Thomas Brennan, Irish immigrant, mid-19th century, 1857 to 1886. Without more specific context about who he was or why his story mattered, it seemed like one of thousands of similar documents we have. Interesting to social historians studying immigrant experiences generally, but not something that would attract widespread attention or seem particularly unique." Sarah nodded, understanding the practical realities of archival work. There were simply too many documents, too many voices from the past, for archives to deeply investigate every single item. Significance often emerged only when researchers brought external context, connecting seemingly ordinary documents to larger stories. That's exactly what she was doing now. She opened the journal carefully, supporting the spine properly to avoid stressing the binding. The first entry was dated September 15, 1857, just 12 days after Thomas had arrived at the Whitmore household, and the handwriting showed slight tremors of emotion or perhaps physical exhaustion. "I begin this record not knowing if I shall have the courage or discipline to continue it, or if indeed anyone shall ever read these words beyond myself. Yet I feel compelled, almost driven, to document this strange new life, so different from everything I knew before the darkness came to Ireland, before the hunger took my family, before I became a man without a country or a home." The early entries painted a vivid picture of a young man struggling desperately to find his place in a foreign land whose language he spoke but whose customs and expectations remained mysterious and often frightening. Thomas wrote of his initial awkwardness in the Whitmore household, his constant fear of making mistakes that might cost him his position, his profound loneliness for the family and homeland he had lost. He described lying awake at night in his small room in the servants' quarters, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an American city, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake in leaving Ireland, even though there had been nothing left for him there but starvation and despair. But gradually, entry by entry, the tone shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. October 17, 1857. Something remarkable occurred today, something that has left me confused but cautiously hopeful. Mr. Whitmore asked my opinion regarding a discrepancy in a shipment accounting. I hesitated, deeply uncertain if it was my place to speak, if perhaps this was some kind of test where the correct answer was silence. But his expression was genuinely curious, not testing or threatening. He seemed to actually want my thoughts. I pointed out what seemed to me an obvious calculation error, showed him the numbers, explained my reasoning tentatively. He studied my work carefully, checking my mathematics, then looked at me with an expression I had not seen directed at me before. Surprise, yes, but also something that might have been respect. "Where did you learn mathematics?" he asked. When I told him honestly of my time at the seminary in Cork, of the education I had received before circumstance destroyed those plans, I saw his understanding change visibly. He sees me differently now, I think. I am uncertain what this means for my position here, but it feels like something important has shifted. Sarah read through months and then years of entries, watching Thomas's confidence grow incrementally as the Whitmores recognized and actively nurtured his abilities. There were touching descriptions of teaching young William Whitmore mathematics, of the boy's initial resistance giving way to genuine enthusiasm once Thomas found the right approach. There were accounts of evening discussions with Charles Whitmore about literature and political philosophy, conversations that Thomas initially found terrifying but gradually came to treasure. There were observations about Catherine Whitmore's kindness, her efforts to make Thomas feel less isolated, her invitations to join family activities during holidays when Thomas's loneliness became particularly acute. One entry from Christmas 1858 was especially moving. "Today Mrs. Whitmore insisted I join the family for Christmas dinner, not as a servant but as a guest at their table. I protested, knowing this was not proper, knowing what society would think. But she would hear none of my objections. "Thomas," she said with that gentle firmness she possesses, "you are alone in this country, far from everyone who knew you before. We cannot replace your lost family, but we can offer you ours. Please." I sat at their table, shared their meal, and for the first time since arriving in America, I felt something other than exile. I felt, perhaps, the beginning of belonging. But it was an entry from April 20, 1861, written 2 days after the photograph Sarah had discovered, that stopped her completely, forcing her to pause and collect herself emotionally before continuing. The photographer came today to create a formal family portrait. Mr. Whitmore insisted I be included in the image over my repeated protests. I knew my place, or thought I did. I am household staff, however kindly treated. My inclusion seemed inappropriate, a violation of social boundaries that exist for reasons, even if those reasons are not always just. But Mr. Whitmore would hear none of my objections, cutting me off almost sharply when I began my third attempt to decline. "Thomas," he said, and his tone was serious in a way I have learned to recognize and respect, "you are part of this family's story. That is not a statement of sentimentality, not an exaggeration for emotional effect, but a statement of fact. Your contributions to this household, both practical and intangible, your care for our children, your friendship which Catherine and I value beyond measure, these are not erased by the accidents of birth or nationality or social class. History should remember that you stood with us in this moment, at the beginning of what may be a terrible war, as events unfold that will define this nation's character." As I took my place near the family for the portrait, I became suddenly, intensely conscious of the mark on my wrist, visible where my sleeve had shifted during the positioning. It is always there, of course, a permanent reminder of how I came to this life, but I do not often think about it anymore. In that moment, about to be captured in a photograph that would last beyond all our lifetimes, I moved instinctively to adjust my sleeve, to hide the mark, embarrassed that it would be visible in the family portrait. But Mr. Whitmore noticed and stopped me with a gentle hand on my arm. "Let it show," he said quietly, so only I could hear. "That mark represents something important, Thomas. It represents the beginning of your American story. There is no shame in it, none whatsoever. There is only honor. Honor in surviving what you survived. Honor in accepting help when you needed it. Honor in proving yourself worthy of the chance you were given, though you owed no one any such proof. You are who you are because of your character, not despite your circumstances." I find myself moved beyond words even now, hours later, as I try to record these feelings. In Ireland, I was educated but poor, trapped by circumstances of a disaster I could not control, A catastrophe that struck an entire nation. Here, I wear a mark that identifies me as an immigrant who needed help, yes. But Mr. Whitmore is right. That mark has become something else entirely. It is a reminder that I survived when so many did not. That I was given a chance when chances were rare. That someone believed I was worth helping, worth investing in, worth seeing as a full human being rather than a problem or a statistic. There is honor in that. There is profound honor in accepting help when it is offered with genuine respect and human dignity, just as there is honor in working hard to prove oneself worthy of that help, worthy of that faith. Sarah had to pause in her reading, wiping her eyes discreetly, grateful that the archive reading room was nearly empty that afternoon. This was the voice she had been searching for, the internal experience behind the formal portrait, the human reality beneath the historical abstractions of immigration and social class. This was Thomas Brennan, not as an anonymous servant in someone else's photograph, but as a complex, thoughtful, deeply feeling person whose inner life was as rich as anyone's. The journal continued through the war years, providing a fascinating perspective on the Civil War from someone who was not originally American but who came to see the conflict as fundamentally about human dignity, about whether America would live up to its stated ideals or fall short. Thomas wrote about his complex feelings, about his initial sense that this was not his war, not his fight, but gradually coming to understand that any struggle for human freedom and dignity was universal, transcended national boundaries. He described how he and Charles Whitmore worked together to keep the textile business running during the war's disruptions while also secretly contributing substantial sums to abolitionist causes. The Whitmores, it turned out, were more than just theoretical progressives. They put their money and their reputations on the line for principles they believed in. There was an extensive entry about the train accident in 1862, written weeks later during Thomas's painful recovery, his handwriting shakier than usual, probably because his injuries still affected his coordination. I remember nothing of the accident itself, nothing of the crash or the immediate aftermath. The last clear memory I have is of sitting in the rail car with Charles, discussing textile contracts, the mundane details of business. Then nothing. Darkness. When I finally woke, I was in a strange hospital bed, my body broken in ways I am only beginning to understand, my mind confused and clouded by pain and whatever medicines they had given me. I had no way to identify myself, no documents on my person that had survived the accident legibly, no ability to communicate clearly through the fog of injury and pain. I learned later that I had been listed as John Doe, identity unknown, likely to be buried in a pauper's grave if I died, which the doctors apparently expected. But Charles would not abandon me. Could not abandon me. He spent 3 days going systematically to every hospital between Providence and New York, looking for me, describing me to anyone who would listen, refusing to give up despite being told repeatedly that finding one injured man among the chaos of the accident's aftermath was nearly impossible. When he finally found me, it was the mark on my wrist that confirmed my identity beyond any doubt. That mark, which I once thought of as evidence of my lowly status, became the thread that connected me back to life, back to family, back to purpose and meaning. Charles wept when he found me. I was barely conscious, unable to speak clearly, but I remember that. I remember seeing tears on his face, this man who is always so controlled, so proper in his emotions. He was not crying as an employer relieved to locate a missing servant whose loss would be inconvenient. He was crying as a friend who had feared losing someone genuinely dear. In that moment, through the haze of pain and confusion, I understood something profound about what had happened to both of us over the past 5 years. We had become friends. True friends, despite all the social barriers that were supposed to make such friendship impossible. The mark on my wrist, the symbol of how we began, had become something entirely different. It was not about hierarchy anymore. It was about connection, about being seen, about being known, about mattering to another human being. Sarah continued reading, losing track of time as the afternoon faded into evening. Thomas eventually married in 1865 to a woman named Ellen McCarthy, a teacher at a small school for Irish immigrant children. Their courtship, as described in the journal, was sweet and respectful. Ellen was educated, intelligent, and according to Thomas's admiring descriptions, possessed a fierce dedication to helping immigrant children get the education they needed to succeed in America. They had 3 children together: Margaret, born 1866, James, born 1868, and Catherine, born 1871. The journal entries became less frequent as Thomas's responsibilities grew, as his life became busier and fuller, but they remained substantive and thoughtful when he did write. The entries documented births and first steps and childhood illnesses. They recorded business partnerships, as Thomas's role in the Whitmore textile business evolved from household assistant to what we might today call a business manager or partner. They described holidays celebrated together, summers spent at the Whitmore family's cottage on Cape Cod, a deepening friendship between the Brennan and Whitmore children. There were entries about Charles Whitmore's death in 1879, about Catherine's grief, about Thomas's own sense of profound loss at losing not just an employer but a friend who had fundamentally changed his life. "He saw me when others would not," Thomas wrote. "He gave me a chance to become who I was meant to be. I owe him everything, but he would be angry if I said that. He always insisted that I earned everything myself, that he merely provided opportunity. Perhaps we are both right. Perhaps that is the nature of true friendship, true mentorship. The giver gives, the receiver receives, and both are transformed by the exchange." The final entry in the journal, written in 1886, showed an older Thomas reflecting on his life with the wisdom of age and experience. His handwriting was shakier now, the natural tremors of aging affecting his once perfect penmanship. "I am 60 years old now, and my hands shake as I write these words. Ellen teases me affectionately that I should hire a young person to write my correspondence, but I persist stubbornly in doing it myself. Perhaps it is vanity, or perhaps it is that writing connects me to who I was, to the journey I have traveled from that desperate young man who arrived in Boston with nothing but hope and help. I look at my grandchildren playing in the garden of our home in Cambridge, and I marvel at the impossible distance between my beginning and this moment. They are Americans, born to opportunity, unburdened by the sorrows and fears that shaped my youth. They will never know hunger as I knew it, never feel the desperation of being utterly alone in the world. Yet I hope they will understand, when they are old enough, the importance of that mark their grandfather once wore on his wrist. I hope they will understand that we all carry marks, visible or invisible, that tell the story of where we have been, who helped us along the way, and who we became through that help. Kindness, genuine human kindness that sees beyond social barriers and rigid hierarchies, that recognizes the inherent worth and potential of every person regardless of their circumstances, this is what transforms lives and ultimately transforms societies. The Whitmores gave me more than employment, more than wages and a place to live. They gave me dignity. They gave me respect. They gave me a chance to become who I was meant to be. And that mark on my wrist, which some ignorant people might have seen as shameful, I wore with pride throughout my life. Because it represented hope in the midst of despair. Because it represented humanity at its best. Because it represented what is possible when people choose to see each other truly, without the blinders of prejudice and preconception. May my children and grandchildren remember this. May they extend to others the same chances I was given. May they see people, truly see them, and offer help without condescension, accept help without shame. This is how we build a better world, one connection at a time, one act of genuine human kindness at a time. 6 months after first examining the Whitmore family portrait with her magnifying glass, Sarah Mitchell stood in a small but elegant gallery at the Massachusetts Historical Society, making final adjustments to the exhibition she had spent countless hours creating. The portrait hung prominently on the main wall, professionally lit to show every detail without causing damage to the delicate daguerreotype. But now it was no longer anonymous, no longer just another period photograph of a wealthy family. Beside it, carefully displayed in climate-controlled cases, were pages from Thomas Brennan's journal, letters from Charles Whitmore, correspondence between the two families spanning decades, and photographs showing Thomas's descendants, a family that had thrived in America across 5 generations. The exhibition was titled, Beyond the Frame, Thomas Brennan and the Invisible History of American Immigration. It had attracted significant attention from both academic circles and the general public, featured in articles in the Boston Globe and the New York Times, discussed on local NPR stations, and generating social media interest that surprised everyone involved. People were fascinated by this forgotten narrative of human connection across social divides, hungry for stories that complicated simple historical narratives and showed the complexity of real human relationships. Sarah watched as early visitors moved through the carefully designed space, reading the documents, studying the photographs, spending long minutes in front of interactive displays that provided context about Irish immigration, the Great Famine, domestic labor in 19th century America, and the evolution of the Brennan and Whitmore families across generations. Many visitors had tears in their eyes as they read excerpts from Thomas's journal or the letters describing the train accident and its aftermath. She had spent months working closely with Thomas's descendants, particularly his great-great-granddaughter, Patricia Brennan Morrison, a retired high school history teacher from Cambridge who had inherited family photographs, documents, and stories she had never fully understood until Sarah's research provided context and meaning. Patricia had been instrumental in the exhibition's development, offering insights and access to materials that transformed it from an academic exercise into something deeply personal and emotionally resonant. Patricia approached Sarah now, elegant in a dark blue dress, her eyes bright with emotion that was clearly a mixture of joy, pride, and grief for ancestors she had never known but now understood in new ways. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about her grandfather Thomas," Patricia said, her voice thick with feeling. "But they were just family stories, you know? Passed down through generations, embellished probably, disconnected from historical context. I never imagined there was this much depth to them, this much documentation, this much evidence that he was a real person who mattered, who made a difference. You've given me back a piece of my history I didn't even know I was missing. You've given my children and grandchildren a legacy to be proud of." Sarah smiled warmly, reaching out to squeeze Patricia's hand. "Your ancestor was truly remarkable, Patricia. What strikes me most powerfully, what I keep coming back to, is his perspective. He had every reason to be bitter about the circumstances that forced him to leave Ireland, about the barriers he faced here in America, about the prejudices that limited his opportunities despite his abilities. Instead, he chose deliberately to see the mark on his wrist as a symbol of hope rather than shame. That takes extraordinary character and strength." "I found something else," Patricia said, pulling a small antique wooden box from her large handbag. "After you first contacted me months ago, I went through some old family things stored in my attic, boxes I hadn't opened in decades. I found this tucked away in a corner." She opened the box carefully to reveal a faded sepia photograph and a small piece of tarnished metal. Sarah carefully examined the metal piece, her breath catching as she recognized what it was. It was an identification badge, brass with intricate engraving despite its age, with a number carefully inscribed, 1857 to 473. The same number that appeared in Thomas's records at the Boston Society for the Protection of Irish Laborers. This was his original identification badge, the physical manifestation of that mark on his wrist that had started this entire journey of discovery. "My God, Patricia," Sarah breathed reverently. "This is the actual badge Thomas would have worn when he first arrived, along with the wrist mark. This is an incredibly rare find. Most of these were lost or discarded long ago. This might be the only surviving example. Do you understand how historically significant this is?" "There's more," Patricia said, her hands trembling slightly with emotion as she unfolded the photograph. It showed an elderly Thomas Brennan, probably in his mid-70s based on his appearance, standing with a younger man in an expensive suit in front of what appeared to be a substantial house. The photograph was professional quality, probably from the early 1890s. This is Thomas with the eldest Whitmore grandson, Charles Whitmore Jr., taken around 1893 based on family notes. On the back, there's an inscription. Sarah turned the photograph over carefully and read the elegant script, clearly written by an educated hand. "Thomas Brennan, dear friend and mentor, with Charles Whitmore Jr., October 1893. 2 generations connected by respect, deep affection, and the shared belief that character and integrity transcend circumstance, class, and the accidents of birth. May this bond never be forgotten, and may future generations honor the friendship that began with courage and kindness in difficult times. The Whitmores and Brennans stayed close for generations, Patricia explained, her voice filled with pride. This wasn't just a story from the 1860s that faded away. The connection lasted. My great-grandmother grew up playing with Whitmore children, attending the same social events, their families genuinely intertwined. When my grandmother needed help paying for nursing school in the 1930s during the Depression, it was a Whitmore descendant, some kind of cousin by that point, who provided a substantial scholarship with no expectation of repayment. The connection that began with Thomas and Charles, built on respect and genuine friendship, it echoed through time, affecting generations neither man would ever meet. Sarah added the badge and photograph to the exhibition immediately, updating the displays with these new precious discoveries. As she worked, Professor James Hartwell arrived, bringing with him a surprise visitor he had contacted after learning about the exhibition, Elizabeth Whitmorchin, a direct descendant of Charles Whitmore who lived in San Francisco but had flown cross-country specifically for the opening. Elizabeth was a lawyer in her mid-40s, sophisticated and articulate, dressed in an elegant suit that suggested professional success. She approached Sarah with genuine warmth and a slightly emotional expression. "My family has always known about Thomas Brennan," Elizabeth explained as they toured the exhibition together, she and Patricia meeting for the first time despite their family's long connection. "But I'll admit with some embarrassment that we didn't fully understand or appreciate the depth of the relationship until your research brought everything into clear focus. We have letters in our family archives, documents my great-great-grandfather Charles wrote to his sons urging them to maintain the friendship with the Brennan family, to honor the bond that had been forged, to understand its importance. He wrote that Thomas had taught him to see people truly, beyond the social categories and prejudices that blinded most men of his time and, he worried, might blind his own descendants if they weren't careful." As the exhibition opening continued into the evening, something extraordinary and unexpected happened. More descendants appeared, drawn by the news coverage, by word of mouth, by the powerful human impulse to connect with history and family. There were Brennans and Whitmores, certainly, but also descendants of other Irish immigrants who had been helped by the Boston Society for the Protection of Irish Laborers, people who had similar stories, similar marks, similar journeys from desperation to dignity. An elderly man named Patrick O'Connor approached Sarah with tears streaming down his weathered face. "My great-grandfather came over in 1859, placed by the same society," he said, his voice breaking. "Thomas worked for a family in Cambridge. He wore a mark just like Thomas Brennan's. We have an old photograph from the 1880s, and I always wondered what that mark on his wrist meant. My father didn't know, my grandfather never explained before he died. Now I finally understand. It wasn't shame. It wasn't servitude. It was hope. It was dignity. It was proof that someone cared enough to help." Sarah found herself surrounded by living history, by the realization that these stories she had uncovered, once thought lost or insignificant, mattered profoundly to real people living today. The mark on Thomas Brennan's wrist, barely visible in a 160-year-old photograph, had become a symbol of something larger and more important: the possibility of genuine human connection across divides of class and nationality, the power of respect and dignity, the way individual acts of courage and kindness ripple forward through generations, affecting people who never meet the original actors in the drama. That evening, after the crowds had finally dispersed and the gallery lights were dimmed, Sarah stood alone before the portrait one final time. Thomas Brennan looked back at her across nearly 2 centuries, his expression serene and dignified, his wrist bearing that mark with quiet pride. Beside him, the Whitmore family, captured in a moment that historians had dismissed as routine for over 150 years, now revealed as a testament to something rare and precious. Sarah thought about the journey that had begun 6 months ago with a simple observation: a mark on a wrist that caught her trained eye. That mark had led her through archives and journals, through letters and oral histories, revealing a story of immigration, friendship, and human decency that challenged easy categorizations of the past. She had found Thomas's voice, his thoughts, his internal life, rescuing him from the anonymity that consumed so many people whose lives were considered insignificant by their contemporaries. The American Civil War would begin just weeks after that photograph was taken, tearing the nation apart in a conflict over fundamental questions of human freedom, dignity, and rights. Hundreds of thousands would die. The nation's character would be tested and transformed. In the midst of all that historical drama, the quiet personal relationship between Charles Whitmore and Thomas Brennan seemed perhaps like a small thing, a minor footnote to larger events. But Sarah understood now, after months immersed in their story, that it wasn't small at all. It was everything. It was proof that even in the darkest times, even across the rigid social boundaries of the 19th century, human connection was possible. Genuine respect was possible. Real friendship was possible. Two men who society said should never be equals, who were born into completely different circumstances and faced completely different challenges, had chosen to see each other as fully human, had built something together that transcended their original roles, had created a legacy that enriched generations. The mark on Thomas Brennan's wrist, which he had once feared and later embraced, told a story that America needed to hear now as much as ever. Not a simple story of victimhood or salvation, not a naive tale that ignored real injustices and barriers, but a complex, nuanced narrative of two men who chose dignity over prejudice, who built genuine friendship across divides, who demonstrated that character and respect could triumph over circumstance and social hierarchy. As Sarah finally turned off the gallery lights and prepared to leave, she paused one last time before the portrait. "Thank you, Thomas," she whispered into the darkness, "for writing it all down, for being thoughtful enough, careful enough, to document your journey, for helping us understand that history isn't just about the famous or powerful, but about ordinary people whose quiet acts of courage, dignity, and kindness shape the world in ways we're only beginning to understand. Your mark mattered. Your life mattered. Your story matters. And now, finally, people will know." The portrait remained in the darkness, but the story it told would continue to resonate, touching hearts and changing minds, a reminder that we all carry marks, visible or invisible, that connect us to those who helped us, those who saw us truly, those who gave us chances to become who we were meant to be. And perhaps most importantly, a reminder that we all have the power to be that person for someone else, to be the one who sees potential where others see only problems, to be the one who offers dignity and respect across whatever divides society constructs, to be the one whose kindness echoes across generations. In a small gallery in Boston, a 160-year-old photograph of a family and their household assistant continued to hang on the wall, no longer forgotten, no longer anonymous, no longer just another artifact of a distant past. It had become what all the best history should be, a bridge connecting us to our shared humanity, a mirror reflecting both who we were and who we could choose to become, a testament to the enduring power of seeing people truly, of offering help with dignity, of accepting help with grace, and of building connections that transcend every barrier.